find here in this passage. Mark 1, verses 9 through 13. At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending upon him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." At once, the Spirit sent him out into the wilderness. And he was in the wilderness 40 days, being tempted by Satan. He was with the wild animals, and angels attended him. In the midst of all of that, what I especially want you to focus on today is verse 12. The Spirit immediately sent him out into the wilderness. Or here's what that sounds like in the New Revised Standard Version. The Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. Now, one of the implications when we read that is this. Jesus wasn't planning on this, was he? I mean, he wasn't planning on this trip into the wilderness. Instead, probably the human side of him was thinking, again, divine but human. Probably the human side of Jesus was thinking, having just been baptized by John, blessed by God in that way. Probably the human side of Jesus was thinking, here we go, it's time to get going with my ministry. I've got things to do, right? I need to be preaching and teaching, healing and helping. And yet in the midst of Jesus probably having that mindset, what happens instead is this: the Spirit that has now descended upon him, the Spirit of God, the Spirit is, instead of sending him on his way, does this. He sends Jesus, he drives Jesus into the wilderness so that Jesus might find what there? A time of testing, but also therefore time of soul searching, a time of deep reflection. Guys, with that image as our guide today, here's what we've got to acknowledge initially. These times of intentional reflection, these times of intentional soul searching, this is something that must be a regular part of our walk with God as well, especially during this season of Lent. And so that being our focus today, guys, here's what we've got to struggle with initially in this new series. If we know we need times like this, if we know we need these things in our lives, that they can be gifts to us, if we know we need these things, then why is it that we often only search for God here in the midst of this worship experience? Or let me say it maybe in this way. If we know we need these times of soul searching, introspection, encountering God in life, if we know we need these times, then why is it that often, we're not looking for God out there. We're not looking for God in our daily lives beyond this time of worship? That being our question today, here are some things that I think often lead us down that path. Here's a first. First off, sometimes I think we fail to pursue God throughout the week in the nooks and crannies of each of our days. Sometimes I think we fail to pursue God in the midst of everyday life because it's so easy to get caught up in thinking that this is all that really matters. Some of us maybe that was imprinted upon us growing up. Some of us maybe have just grown to default to this. But I think sometimes we fail to seek and find God in our everyday lives because we've come to understand this is all that matters. This time of worship, this time of praising God, this time of seeking out his presence, but almost exclusively seeking it out here. I want you to think about this for a minute and And this certainly won't always apply because, we all utter these words from time to time. But I want you to think about this for a minute. If you were to ask someone about their faith, right? If you were to ask someone about their faith, let's say, far too often, the answer you're going to hear is this: well, I attend this church, or I go to that church. And while those words aren't inherently bad, they might be words we just throw out from time to time, attend and go to, right? While those words might be innocent almost all the time, using those words still clearly points us to this. Whether we're asking or answering, using those kinds of words still can't help but point us to this: faith being boiled down to attending worship or going to worship. Or maybe let me take this even deeper by looking at this from the other side of things, because this really does affect so many of us. Think about this from the other side of things. How many times do we ask one another, not even realizing what we're implying through the question? How many times do we ask one another, hey, do your kids, now grown, now usually living far away, how many times do we almost only ask each other this: do your kids go to church? And we don't ask each other, hey, how are they striving to be the presence of Christ in the world where they're now living? Tell me about some of the ways they're making a difference in relationship, following Christ, loving God through their living. We don't ask each other, gosh, in what ways are they serving others? Are they being the presence of Christ in this world? We don't ask that question. Instead, again, hey, do your kids go to church somewhere? And again, maybe it's an okay question, right? I don't want to be too hard on it. But what it implies is this: boiling faith down to just attending worship, because that's what we mean when we say, do they go to church? Now, I'm not trying to overstate this, and I don't want you to misunderstand me here, because worship like this, it's such a critical part of our faith. We need to embrace it. And I say again to those of you worshiping online, we miss you. I know you're being blessed through that as well, but there's just something about being together. And if I might tease, because I think some of your wives have already told you this, if I might tease and poke at you a little bit and say, I know that you love having your dog right there next to your easy chair with your cup of coffee, but maybe once a month, I'd love to greet you. Right, I don't want to be misunderstood, because this time of worship, online or here, this time of worship is really important. But let me tell you this. I know this is true. Let me tell you this. Here's the reality. Some of our kids have a much deeper walk with Christ than we do. They just haven't found a church yet that takes that walk to a deeper level. Or some of our kids, they are serving Christ in some incredibly beautiful ways right now. They just haven't found a church to attend that draws them in as Christ wants them to be drawn in. Bottom line, some of our kids are finding God in their everyday lives. They are so much more than many churchgoers ever will. In the end, the reality for some Christians is this. This is not a judgmental statement. It's just the way it is. The reality for some Christians is this. Their faith is a 1 hour a week faith. Meaning worship is the only time they truly do seek God out. And I think we'd all agree, if you do that, then you're going to fail to find God. And in some of the places He wants you to find Him. You're going to fail to find God in some of the ways He wants you to find Him. Most of our lives are spent, this is pretty obvious. I pulled up the number of hours this was, and then I forgot to write it down, but I don't think you need a number. If we worship for an hour each week, y'all know there are a lot of hours in the week. So can we say almost all of our lives are spent beyond this time, right? So of course, what do we know? Seeking and finding God in our everyday living, critical. And maybe this doesn't relate to many of us today. Maybe it doesn't relate to any of us who are worshiping together today. Maybe this isn't something we struggle with. But let me just say this anyway. If there's something in you, however small it might be, if there's something in you today that makes you think, maybe I am only a 1 hour a week Christian. If there's anything like that within you today, then first confess that. Then after you do that, then also do this. Make a commitment today. And I hope for some of us, if we recognize today, man, I don't seek him out enough, then make a commitment today to begin to seek God out in other parts of your life. Because if you'll do that, not just one thing, but two things. First off, you'll find him there beyond this time. But secondly, this will also happen if you begin to seek him out in other part of your lives. He is going to be delighted that you've finally started looking for him there, right? That's the reality. Bring God some joy if you haven't looked for him there before. Here's another reason I think we often fail to search for God beyond just this time of worship, because we're just not intentional about it. Hope y'all don't get tired of me using that word a lot of Sundays, but a lot of our faith and truly being faithful boils down to greater intentionality. So let me say that again. Another reason I think we often fail to search for God beyond this time of worship, because we're not intentional enough. What does that mean? It means, maybe we hope to bump into God somehow this afternoon and the week ahead. We'd love to stumble upon him, right? But in the end, we're not really trying to intentionally make that happen, right? We're not sowing seeds that can grow into a true divine encounter. Now, when it comes to this second thought, I think there are a couple of things that apply here. And the first is this. Sometimes we're not intentional about searching for God beyond this time because we're not prioritizing that in our schedules, right? We're not carving out time for that in our daily lives, carving out time to seek him out and sense his presence and then reflect a bit on that. And it's not most of the time that we don't realize that a 1 hour a week faith is not what we're called to. Oftentimes we don't carve out that time also, not because we don't want to encounter God. It's just that often we let our schedule swallow us up. And the next thing we know is this: we haven't spent any time that day seeking him out. We haven't spent any time that day looking for God's presence. Guys, think back to our passage for a moment. Here again are verses 12 and 13. At once the Spirit sent him out into the wilderness. You can do it. You can find that answer button or that turn down button. You got it, man. Things you're going to miss out on when you're online. Maybe you heard that. Guys, think back to our passage for a moment. Here again are verses 12 and 13. At once the Spirit sent him out into the wilderness. Think of the word drove him out into the wilderness. And he was in the wilderness for 40 days. Now, I lead us to that again for this reason. Because while at times God's Spirit will be that which drives us into an encounter with God, while that will sometimes be the case, at other times, and we see this in Jesus' life more often than not, at other times, most of the time, we're going to be the ones in charge of creating that space in which a divine encounter can take place. So first, when it comes to intentionality, we do have to make sure we're clearing space for that in our lives, the possibility of those encounters. But then even if we do that, we've still got to then pay attention to this. How at times, even when the space is cleared, at times we still often fail to find God out there, so to speak. Why? Because our expectations are so low. Can we admit that today? This applies to maybe almost all of us, or maybe all of us. I mean, honestly, we can clear the space. We can say, I want to encounter God during the week, and yet deep within we're thinking, I don't really think it's going to happen, but God, I'll look for you, you know. Low expectations can also be that which really gets in our way. And if there's, again, any of that in us today, and that's something else we've got to really work on. For example, and this is just a way to begin to tap into some of what's ahead in the series for us. But for example, next week, we're going to be talking about finding God in creation. And I wonder, you know, when you head out for a walk, when you head out for a jog, when you find yourself out on the lake, when you find yourself on the first tee, right, as well, when you get out into nature and creation, you know, are you thinking, you know, how might I encounter God today in the midst of this time in creation? If you're thinking that way, I mean, you're going to experience him. You're going to find him in a variety of ways. If you're not thinking that way, you know, then probably not. And let me just tease some of you and say this. You know, you can find God in the midst of a double bogey as much as an eagle, right? So just keep your heart open no matter what's going on the green or on the fairway or on the tee box. Enough. In 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about finding God in the midst of our relationships. That's just a few weeks out. And so again, I wonder, when you engage relationship, and with those God has placed in your life, in the midst of those interactions, again, do you expect to sense God? Do you expect to see him there? Do you expect to hear his voice? Because again, I promise you this, if you bring that kind of expectation into those interactions, those conversations, I mean, you're going to find God there in some significant ways. Now, even if we do move beyond a 1 hour a week faith, might not have applied to any of us, but maybe that's a hurdle for some of us. Even if we get that and move beyond it, and even if we do bring more intentionality to finding God in our everyday life, even if we do those two things, one possible roadblock still stands in our way. And as I mention this, man, just dig into it deeper. I mean, give this some thought. A final roadblock that stands in our way oftentimes is this, our fear at times. Simply meaning this, sometimes we don't search for God beyond these walls because we're afraid of what we might experience in the midst of that encounter. And that doesn't mean God will be hard on us. That doesn't mean we're going to find a God who doesn't love us deeply. It's going to simply mean God wants to help us work on some of the things we keep pushing down and some of the things we're afraid to work on. And so for some of us, we're thinking, man, you know, I get these other two thoughts, but I'm still afraid for this kind of encounter because I think it's going to hurt to have to deal with some of what is going on in my life. Again, think back to Jesus' experience in today's passage. I mean, here he heads into this potentially fruitful encounter with God, this baptism, the Spirit of God falling upon him. It's all good, right? Again, now let's have him head into his ministry. Here he has this incredible experience with God, and instead of that, then this happens. He's tempted, and he's tested, and he faces great hardship. And even though the result of that is that he is closer to God when he comes through that, as human beings, oftentimes we look at that and what do we see? We only see the testing, we only see the hardship, and therefore we think, I don't want that in my life. I'll stick to finding God here. I'm not sure I want to deal with some of that in life. Truth is, some of our encounters with God, if we're open to them, if we really seek them out, absolutely some of our encounters with God are going to push us, challenge us, get us out of our comfort zone. And yet, even though that's the case, this is also true always. God wouldn't have us going through some of what we're going through as he attempts to help us with that. If you didn't know, it'll help us to grow in our faith. We need that which he can help us kind of resolve and work through. Lastly, we need to just recognize this, that sometimes we fail to seek God out, even when we need God most at times. Sometimes we fail to seek him out because we're afraid, again, of facing some of the struggles that we know we need to face, but we don't want to. And especially in the midst of this season of Lent, especially now, if you feel some of that reluctance in you, then push through that. And push through that in part by something we talked about earlier, raising your expectations. Push through that reluctance of not wanting to encounter him to deal with some things by just raising your expectations, saying deep within what I know you believe, of course, as he helps you work through whatever's going on in your life. He can and will use it for good. This Wednesday, Ash Wednesday, that's when we begin our Lenten journey. A journey that, yes, is going to lead us into death, right? A journey that's going to lead us to the cross, absolutely. But here is this incredible journey that's also going to lead us to what? I mean, resurrection, an empty tomb. So knowing that these next few weeks can absolutely be an incredible time of growth, I pray that you and I this day might simply, again, make a commitment that we'll strive in the midst of this time to not just look for God here, but look for God in every moment of our lives. Let's pray.